My name is Monique Gwynn, 31 years old. At the family dinner my mother held on the first Sunday of every month, she told a table full of relatives that I had been jobless for almost a year while my brother did everything right. She wanted me small in front of everyone. My father nodded along the way he always did. I set my phone on the table and asked one calm question. They did not know I already had evidence behind it. The moment I spoke, the room began turning on the two people who least expected it. That question took 11 months and one accidental sentence to find. Let me start where the falling began. For most of my life, I was the strong one. That was the word they used. Strong. It sounds like a compliment until you notice it only ever came out when they wanted something from me. When Grant needed the last of the hot water, I was strong enough to take a cold shower. When there was one good cut of steak left at dinner, I was strong enough not to mind the dry one. When my parents drove 4 hours to watch Grant's community college soccer games, I was strong enough to understand why no one made it to my graduation. I want to be precise about this because precision is the only thing I trusted by the end. I'm not describing a family that hit me or starved me. I'm describing something quieter, a slow, patient sorting, where one child was the future and the other was the furniture. Grant was the future. I was the thing you leaned on and forgot was holding weight. When Grant turned 18, my parents handed him an envelope at his birthday dinner. Inside was a check for a college fund they'd been building since he was born, and the keys to a used Corolla so he could get to campus. He cried. My mother, Diane, cried. My father, Howard, put a hand on his shoulder and said, "You're going to make us proud." Everyone clapped. When I turned 18, 3 years earlier, I got a book. It was a used paperback with a cracked spine, and the cover said, "Standing on Your Own 2 Feet." Inside, on the title page, someone had written my name in blue pen. They had spelled it wrong, Monique with 2 N's. My mother handed it to me across the same table and said, "You've always been the independent one. You don't need us the way your brother does." I was 18 when I first understood that being called independent was how they said they were not going to help me. I kept the book. I don't fully know why. Maybe because it was the only thing they ever gave me that had my name in it, even misspelled. I put myself through school on loans and 2 jobs. I studied brand strategy, which is a fancy way of saying I learned how to figure out what a company actually is underneath what it says it is, and then help it tell the truth about itself in a way people want to hear. I was good at it. Not lucky good. Worked for it good. By the time I was 28, I had a title, a salary, a small apartment I paid for myself, and a distance from my parents that I mistook for freedom. I thought distance was the finish line. I thought that if I built a life far enough from that dinner table, they could not touch it. What I did not yet understand was that my independence made them uneasy. Every step I took on my own placed more of my life beyond their reach. I did not know then how far they would eventually go to pull me back. Then, in January of 2025, the company I worked for went through a round of cuts, and I was in it. Not for cause, just math. A whole department reduced to a spreadsheet and my name in a red cell. I remember the HR woman saying, "This isn't about your performance," in the same tone you'd use to tell someone their flight was delayed. I was not scared. That is the part I need you to understand about the woman I was that month. I had about 5 months of savings, if I was careful, a strong resume, reliable references, and 8 years of results I could point to. I updated my materials that first weekend, made a list of 40 companies, and started applying. I genuinely believed I would have something new within 6 weeks. I told my parents at the next Sunday dinner. I do not know why. Old habit maybe, or some part of me still hoping. My mother set down her fork and said, Well, maybe this is a sign. My father said, "You could always come work at Roy's insurance office." It was filing and phones, the same offer they had been dangling since I was 22, and it would have kept me 40 minutes from their house indefinitely. I said I'd be fine. Grant, sitting across from me, actually smiled and said, "You'll bounce back. You always do." He meant it kindly. Grant meant almost everything kindly. That's what made the next year so hard to see clearly. The first interview came fast. A mid-size firm, a role I could have done in my sleep. 3 rounds, and by the third I was talking to the people I'd actually be working with, the conversation loose and warm, the kind where you already feel like you have the job. They said they'd be in touch within the week, then nothing. I waited 8 days and sent a polite follow-up. Nothing. I told myself companies move slowly. I moved on to the next one. The second interview went the same way. Strong first round, stronger second, and then a final round that felt less like an interview and more like a conversation between future colleagues. The hiring manager walked me to the elevator herself, then silence. My follow-up email bounced around in the void. By the third and fourth processes, a pattern I could not yet name began pressing at the back of my mind. I was reaching the final round repeatedly. That part was working. I was good in the room. Then, at the point when an offer or rejection should have arrived, the process simply went silent. I did not receive a rejection. I seemed to disappear from consideration. I told myself it was a hard market. Everyone said it was a hard market. By March, my savings had taken on a visible shape, and that shape was shrinking. I arranged to leave my 1-bedroom and moved into a studio that cut my rent almost in half. I remember carrying boxes up 3 flights in the cold. The new place had 1 window facing a brick wall. That night, I sat on the floor, eating cereal because I had not unpacked the pots yet, and said aloud, "This is temporary." The freelance work kept me alive. That came from Claire. Claire Ekberg and I had worked together years before at my first real job, and she was the kind of person who remembered you. When she heard I was between things, she didn't offer sympathy. She offered a client, a small business that needed its messaging cleaned up, cash under a proper contract, enough to buy me another month of runway, then another after that. Claire never once suggested I was struggling because I wasn't good enough. She'd say, "The market's insane right now. It has nothing to do with you," and I clung to that sentence harder than she knew. The first client was a family-owned hardware store trying to figure out why the big chain across the highway was eating them alive. I spent 2 weeks in their aisles, talking to the owner, an exhausted man named Tom, who thought he needed a bigger sign. He didn't need a bigger sign. He needed to stop pretending he was competing on price and start telling people he was the place that would walk you to the exact bolt you needed and stay open late when your pipe burst on a Sunday. I wrote it all down for him plain, and 3 weeks later he called Claire, not me, to say his weekend traffic was up, and he didn't fully understand why, but it felt like someone had finally described his own store back to him. That $500 job did more for me than the money. It was the first evidence, in a season starved of evidence, that I could still do the thing I was good at. More small jobs came: a bakery, a physical therapist, a woman starting a cleaning company out of her car. None of it paid much, but all of it worked, and the pattern of it working sat strangely next to the pattern of my interviews dying. On paper, I was a failed job candidate. In practice, quietly, in the corners of my own life, I was still good at the exact thing everyone kept declining to hire me for. I didn't understand yet how those 2 facts could both be true. I would. But between the freelance jobs, 2 more interview processes died the same way. 5, 6, final round. Warmth, promise, then silence. And slowly, without noticing exactly when it happened, I started to believe my parents. That's the thing about a voice you've heard your whole life. You don't need to agree with it for it to move in. By June, I was lying awake in the studio, doing the math on my savings, which had dropped under $2,000, and hearing my mother's voice say, "Maybe this is a sign." And for the first time, I wondered if she was right. If I really was the one who couldn't stand on her own 2 feet. If the book had been a prophecy instead of an insult. I called home more that summer. That is the part I am least proud of. The lower I sank, the more I reached for the people who had taught me I was sinkable. I also made the mistake of telling them which companies were interviewing me and when the final rounds were scheduled. My mother would ask whether I had taken the job at Roy's yet. When I said no, she would sigh and say, "You've always had to do things the hard way." My father reminded me that Grant had just received a small raise. "There's no shame in steady work," he would say, as if I had claimed there was. Grant himself called me once that summer, on his own, which he almost never did. He asked how I was holding up. I told him the truth, more than I meant to. He was quiet for a second, and then said, "You'll get there. You'll get there like me. You'll see." He said it to comfort me. He had no idea he was quoting the exact logic that was burying me. He had no idea there was anything to bury. In early September, I did something I'd sworn I wouldn't do again. I let myself hope with my whole chest. There was a role at a company called Vireo Brands. Brand strategy, senior level, the kind of job I'd wanted since I was 23. The hiring director was a man named Nathan Brandt, and from the first call we understood each other. He asked me a question about repositioning a failing product line, and I answered it the way I actually thought instead of the way you're supposed to. And there was a pause, and then he laughed and said, "Okay, yeah, where have you been?" 3 rounds, then a 4th that wasn't even a test anymore, just Nathan walking me through what my first 90 days would look like. He told me the team was excited. He told me to expect to hear about next steps by the end of the week. I went home to my studio and let myself imagine it. The salary would end the freelance scramble. The title would put me back on the path I'd been knocked off. I even, God help me, thought about how I'd tell my parents. How this time the news would be too big to shrink. The end of the week came. Then, the weekend. Then Monday. Nothing. I sat in the middle of that studio floor, in the same spot where I'd said this is temporary 6 months earlier, and I felt the last of my hope go out like a pilot light. I didn't cry. I was past crying. I just sat there and thought, all right, maybe I am what they say I am. Maybe I should call Roy's office in the morning. That was the bottom. I want to be honest that I was at the bottom, because what happened next only means something if you know how far down I'd already gone. The phone rang 2 days later. I did not recognize the number and almost let it go. It was Paula Voss, a recruiter who had worked with Vireo and was now calling about a related opening elsewhere. She had received my name through Nathan Brandt. She was warm and fast, the kind of person who had handled hundreds of searches, and she wanted to know whether I was still available. Halfway through the call, she said the sentence that divided my life into before and after. "I have to say, we were sorry to lose you at Vireo. When you withdrew, several of us were genuinely disappointed. Nathan considered you the strongest candidate in the final group." I stopped breathing. "I'm sorry," I said. "When I, what?" "Withdrew. A message came through in September saying you had accepted another offer and were leaving the process. Nathan had been advocating for you. I heard the words, but they would not settle into any shape that made sense. I had never sent that message or withdrawn. I had spent days waiting for Vireo to contact me while its hiring team believed I had chosen to leave." "Paula," I said, keeping my voice level because it was the only control I had left. I never sent that message. I was waiting to hear back and assumed I had been rejected. There was a pause on her end, the silence of a professional realizing that a record might not belong to the person named in it. "That is not what the file says," she replied. "Can you verify the sender's exact address and preserve the original message?" I asked. She said she would first confirm my identity and check with Vireo's hiring team before releasing anything. When the call ended, I sat in the dark and considered, for the first time that year, that the story I had been telling myself about my own failure might not be true. Someone had ended my chance at Vireo by communicating in my name. I did not sleep that night, but I did not spiral either. Something colder than panic settled over me, and it felt almost like relief. If I had not withdrawn, then Vireo had not rejected me for being unqualified. I still had no proof that the other failed processes were connected, and I did not know who had interfered with this one. But the question was no longer only whether I was good enough. It was who had spoken for me and why. The next morning, I stopped assuming I was the problem and began treating the past months like a case. I reviewed every application from that year, company names, interview dates, people I had updated, and every message actually sent from my account. I noted which processes had ended with a clear rejection and which had simply disappeared. The absence of a message in my sent folder did not prove who had acted, but it helped confirm that the Vireo withdrawal had not come from my real account. I built a spreadsheet, not for a job this time, but to separate facts from suspicion. The following day, after verifying my identity and checking with Vireo, Paula sent me a preserved copy of the withdrawal message. I opened it with hands that were not quite steady. It sounded like me. Whoever wrote it knew my usual sign-off and enough about the interview to thank Nathan by name. The sender address looked almost identical to mine, but it contained one extra letter buried in the middle of my surname. A recruiter scanning quickly could miss it. I could not. It was an imitation wearing my name. The timestamp gave me one useful fact. The message had been sent at 10:42 on a Tuesday morning in September. At that time, I had been meeting a freelance client in a coffee shop across town. The calendar entry, receipt, and client could establish where I was. That did not identify the sender, but it supported my statement that I had not written and sent the message during that meeting. I sat with the forgery for a long time, then made two lists. The first contained everyone I had told about Vireo, including the company name and the timing of the final round. The second contained people familiar enough with my email address, writing style, and personal details to imitate me convincingly. The overlap was very small. My parents were the strongest suspects I had, but suspicion was not proof. Grant also knew parts of my job search, and several recruiters had access to my materials, so I refused to accuse anyone before I could test the pattern. I did not want it to be them. Even then, some 18-year-old part of me was still holding the misspelled book and hoping I was wrong. So I did the fair thing. I tested my suspicion before treating it as fact. I owed myself that much before confronting the people who had taught me to distrust my own memory. That Sunday, I mentioned, casually, that one application had ended after a message I had never sent. I watched their reactions without telling them what Paula had found. My mother said, "You've always been disorganized with that sort of thing, honey." My father shrugged. "Computers, who can keep up?" Grant said, "That's so annoying. Something similar happened to a friend of mine." Their responses did not prove anything, but my parents dismissed the problem immediately, while Grant appeared genuinely confused. I filed the difference away. I did not call either reaction a confession. I only noted who became defensive and who asked an ordinary question. But suspicion was not proof. I had spent my whole life being told that I imagined things, overreacted, or remembered them incorrectly. I would not accuse my parents on the strength of one forged message and a reaction at dinner. I needed a controlled test that could show whether someone acted on information only they received. So I built one. The test also had to protect every real applicant and leave an independent record I could not alter afterward. The plan used a private test application inside Anchorline's system, approved by the small compliance team assisting us. It was not a public vacancy, and no real candidate was displaced. The record showed a senior brand strategy interview scheduled for October 3rd. If anyone used the unique applicant link to withdraw, the platform would preserve the time, home network address, and device details associated with the action. Claire and the compliance manager knew it was a test. Outside that small group, I would tell only my parents the company, date, and supposed interview. Grant would hear nothing. Then, we would wait to see whether the opportunity was withdrawn. The link was created only for the test, so any use of it would come from information I deliberately disclosed. Meanwhile, I began applying again through channels my parents did not know. A new email address, a new phone number, and no family updates. Once Nathan understood what had happened at Vireo, he introduced me to Brightwater Collective, a growing brand consultancy looking for someone with my background. I did not treat Brightwater as scientific proof. The hiring process could still end for ordinary reasons, but if an application my parents could not see progressed normally, it would give me another reason to stop treating myself as the common failure. I needed one part of my future to proceed without becoming evidence in the family case. On Sunday, September 28th, I mentioned the Anchorline interview at dinner and made it sound like the opportunity I was counting on. October 3rd, I said, "Senior role. It feels like a real chance." My mother replied, "We'll keep our fingers crossed," and patted my hand. Her hand was warm and dry, and I thought, I hope I'm wrong. I hope your hand is just a hand. Later that evening, I sent my mother the unique applicant link and pretended I wanted her to look over the opportunity before the interview. The link opened a read-only summary unless someone deliberately selected the withdrawal option. I gave her no password and did not send the link to Grant. Then I went home and waited. October 3rd arrived. The test interview was scheduled for 2 p.m. At 11:19 that morning, Claire sent me a screenshot from Anchorline's system. The applicant record had been withdrawn at 11:04 through the unique link tied to the test. The platform had automatically generated a polite withdrawal notice under my name. No forged prose was needed this time. Someone had used information given only to my parents to cancel an interview that did not truly exist while I sat in my studio and watched the action appear in real time. The result preserved the pattern without requiring Claire to impersonate a recruiter or send a deceptive message herself. A second message contained the security log. The withdrawal had come through the same home network previously recorded when I had used Anchorline from my parents' house. The browser and device profile also matched the desktop in their study, a computer I had used there during an earlier visit. It did not identify which person had touched the device, but only my parents had received the test details, and Grant had not been told. The action had come from their household network, the house with the dinner table, the misspelled book, and the hand that had patted mine. The security manager preserved the underlying log so that the screenshot was not the only copy in existence. I read the log 3 times, then placed the phone on my chest and stared at the ceiling. I did not feel triumphant. I felt grief. A small door I had kept open my whole life, the one labeled, "Maybe they love me and do not know how to show it," clicked shut. The test did not prove what had happened in every earlier hiring process, but it proved that someone in my parents' household had interfered when given the chance. Then I sat up and considered the motive. There was no inheritance or family business at stake. Money did not explain why they wanted my applications to fail. Control did. Keeping me uncertain, nearby, and dependent gave them a reason to interfere that fit the pattern of my entire life. It still did not tell me which parent had performed the action or whether both had participated. That distinction would matter later. For now, it told me that my fear was no longer imaginary and that dependence was the outcome their behavior repeatedly encouraged. I sat in my studio and let myself examine what the evidence actually suggested. A daughter who succeeded on her own would need them less. A daughter they could not summon home or steer toward Roy's office would live beyond their control. And if I rose beyond Grant, I would disturb the family hierarchy they had spent years reinforcing. Grant as the future, me as the dependable one who stayed available. That motive fit what they had done. Even if the records could not yet tell me which parent had performed each action or how many earlier opportunities they had touched, I could imagine the story they told themselves, that they were protecting me from aiming too high, catching me before I fell, or preserving a sensible place for me near home. I could hear my mother's voice saying that a smaller disappointment was kinder than a larger failure, and my father's voice insisting that family looked after family. But imagining their justification was not proof. What I knew was narrower and enough. Someone in their household had interfered after receiving information only my parents had been given. I called a friend who worked in employment law not because I had decided to sue, but because I needed to understand my position before I confronted anyone. She was careful with every answer. Litigation might be possible, she said, but proving who had acted, what each lost opportunity had been worth, and how much damage resulted would be costly, uncertain, and slow. The Vireo message and anchor line test were strong evidence for protecting myself and documenting the pattern, but they did not automatically prove every earlier failure or guarantee a courtroom result. You have enough to stop doubting what happened, she said, and enough to secure every channel they might touch. What you do with the evidence after that is your decision. That was when I stopped thinking first about punishment and began thinking about placing the truth somewhere my parents could not privately rewrite it. But first, I got myself free. I removed my parents from every channel connected to my future. I kept the new email address and phone number, changed the recovery information on my accounts, and stopped sharing company names, interview dates, references, or application details. As far as they knew, I was still struggling, still considering Roy's office, and still available to be directed. I let that misunderstanding protect me. In the space where their interference had once been possible, something began to grow without their hands on it. The Brightwater process moved normally rather than miraculously. There was an initial conversation, a formal interview, a meeting with the team, and a working session. Each stage ended with a clear next step instead of unexplained silence. No outside message interrupted it because my parents did not know the company, the email address, the phone number, or the schedule. Over the next 6 weeks, I moved through the process and reached the final round. That progress did not prove what had happened in every earlier search, but it proved I could still compete when no one else spoke in my name. The final round was a working session. They gave me a real client problem, a wellness brand that had grown too fast and lost the thread of what it actually was, and asked me to spend a day with it and come back with a direction. It was the kind of test that would have terrified me a year earlier and thrilled me before that. I sat with it, and somewhere in the middle of that day I noticed my hands were steady and my mind was quiet. And I realized I hadn't felt like myself in 11 months. And here she was, the person I'd been before anyone started drowning her, sitting at a borrowed desk, solving a problem she was built to solve. I walked them through it the next morning. When I finished, the woman who'd become my boss leaned back and said, almost to herself, "Yeah, that's it. That's exactly it." It was the same thing Nathan Brandt had said at Vireo, months and a lifetime ago. Where have you been? And this time no one was going to reach into the dark and take it away. Meanwhile, my parents kept circling. That part still turned my stomach. My mother called more often and pressed harder about Roy's office. My father warned twice that the insurance job wouldn't be on the table forever, and said I was foolish to keep chasing work that clearly was not materializing. They still believed they could make the safe local option look like rescue after enough disappointment. I let them believe I was considering it, answered in vague terms, and gave them no company name, date, contact, or detail they could use against the Brightwater process. Near the end of November, Grant let something slip. He had called the private number I had given him on the condition that he never share it. I told him nothing about Brightwater, the offer, or any interview date, but he noticed that I sounded different and said, "Whatever you're doing, keep at it. You sound like something good is about to happen." He later made an equally vague comment to our parents, without giving them my number or anything specific. 2 days afterward, my mother called through the old number in the suite, careful tone I had learned to distrust. "Come to the family dinner on December 7th, she said. "Everyone will be there. We're worried you're about to make a rash decision." They did not know what had changed, or where to reach into it. They only sensed that I was moving beyond their control. I did not argue. I had learned that arguing with them was like arguing with a locked door. I said, "I'll be there," ended the call, and began preparing. I had decided where the truth belonged, not in a lawsuit or a screaming phone call, but at the first Sunday table where my mother had handed me the misspelled book, where Grant had received an envelope, and where relatives had watched me become smaller without asking why. My parents had chosen December 7th as a room full of family pressure. I would use the same room as a place for evidence, with witnesses who could no longer be told afterward that I had misunderstood. By then, 2 things had made me ready. The first came on November 21st. Brightwater Collective offered me the senior brand strategist position at $81,000 a year, with benefits and a January start date. I read the letter standing in my studio, then sat in the same place where I had once looked at the brick wall and called the room temporary. I signed that night and saved copies beyond every account my parents had ever known. My career was no longer a hope they could interrupt or a possibility they could talk me out of. It was a dated agreement secured through a channel they had never touched. The second had happened at the November 2nd dinner, the previous regular gathering. While pressing me to be realistic, my mother leaned across the table and lowered her voice so the relatives would not hear. "You need to accept your limits, Monique. Did you really think you were going to leap over your brother? That was never going to be you." Then she raised her voice brightly for the room. "We just want what's best for her." I did not react or tell her what I knew. I wrote the words down that night with the date, place, and people present. Her statement did not prove who had operated the anchor line link or establish every earlier act of interference, but it exposed the hierarchy she wanted preserved and gave context to the pressure that followed. She had described my success as something that should never rise above Grant's. On December 6th, the night before the dinner, I packed a small bag. My phone was charged, with copies stored elsewhere. The printed folder contained the preserved Vireo withdrawal, the comparison between the false address and my real one, my meeting records from the timestamp, the approved anchor line test documentation, the home network and device match, and my signed Brightwater offer. I did not expect everyone to read every page at the table. I wanted every claim beside the record supporting it. At the bottom of the bag, I placed the cracked copy of Standing on Your Own 2 Feet, my name still misspelled inside. I brought it because that table had once used the book to define what I was allowed to expect from my family. This time, I would decide what it meant. I slept. That surprised me. I slept well. Sunday, December 7th, came gray and cold. My parents' house was full when I arrived. Coats piled on the bed, Aunt Meredith in the kitchen, cousins in the living room, and my mother's pot roast in the air. It had the familiar warmth of a family that looked good from outside. Grant hugged me at the door and said, "You look good. You look like you." He had no idea what was coming. Neither did my parents. We sat. The table was long, extended with the leaf my father only put in for the crowded Sundays. I sat where I always sat, near the end, the furniture seat. My mother sat at the head of her side, in command of the room the way she always was. It didn't take long. It never did. Aunt Meredith asked how the search was going. Before I could answer, my mother answered for me, as she had done throughout my life. "Oh, don't get her started," she said, laughing lightly for the table. "It's been almost a year. She keeps reaching for these big jobs, and they keep falling through. There is a steady position at Roy's whenever she is ready to be realistic." Then she turned toward me and softened her voice into the pitying register she used when she wanted cruelty to sound like concern. "You should watch how your brother does it, honey. Grant kept his head down and did everything right. There is no shame in learning from him." The response was not unanimous. One cousin looked at me with sympathy, another focused on his plate, and someone murmured that the market had been difficult. My father nodded with rehearsed concern, presenting himself as the patient parent of a difficult daughter. Grant looked down, visibly uncomfortable, because even without knowing the truth, he could hear that the comparison was cruel and that my mother had chosen an audience for it. I understood that this was the moment, not because I had planned her exact words, but because she had again used the table to make my failure look natural and her control look like concern. I set my phone on the table, face up, and placed the printed folder beside it. "Mom," I said. My voice was calm because I had rehearsed the facts, not a performance. "Can I ask you something in front of everyone?" She smiled as though she expected an apology or a promise to call Roy. "Of course, sweetheart." On October 3rd, someone used a private Anchor Line application link to withdraw a senior role interview under my name. The link had been created as a controlled security test after Vireo received a withdrawal I never sent. Only the small compliance team and the two of you had access to that unique link. I did not withdraw it, and Grant was never told about it. So my question is simple. Which one of you used the link? For 1 second, 1 single second, my mother's face did something I'd never seen it do. It went blank. Not confused. Blank. The blankness of a person whose script has just been taken away. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said, but she said it a half beat too late, and everyone at that table has a body that knows what a half beat too late means. "That is all right," I said. "The system preserved the withdrawal at 11:04 that morning. The action came through the same home network previously recorded when I used Anchor Line from this house, with a browser and device profile matching the desktop in your study." I turned my phone toward the table, then opened the printed log beside it. The record does not identify which person touched the device. It does establish where the action originated and that the unique link had been used. Silence settled unevenly around the table. Aunt Meredith put down her glass. One cousin asked, "Wait, what?" Another leaned closer to see the document. My mother recovered the way people like her always recover, by getting bigger. "Monique," she said, sharp now, the sweetness gone. This is exactly the kind of dramatic, ungrateful thing. You come into my home and you accuse us of, do you hear yourself? You've had a hard year and you're looking for someone to blame, and you've decided it's your parents who've done nothing but worry about you. Anchor line was not the first warning, I continued, keeping my voice level and opening the first section of the folder. In September, Vireo received a withdrawal message from an address designed to resemble mine. Paula Voss preserved the record after confirming my identity and checking with Vireo's hiring team. I had never withdrawn. The sender knew Nathan's name, the stage of the process, and how I usually wrote. I placed the address comparison, timestamp, and my meeting records beside the anchor line log. I cannot prove that every earlier interview ended because of you. I am not claiming that. I can prove that Vireo was ended in my name, and that the controlled anchor line opportunity was withdrawn through this household's network after I told only you about it. My father looked down. His jaw tightened before he said, "You do not understand the pressure we were under." Then he stopped. It was not a full confession, and I did not call it one. But it was the first time either parent had answered as though the interference required an explanation rather than denying that any interference had occurred. My mother turned toward the relatives and spread her hands. "This is absurd. We are her family. Everything we did because we love her. We did not want to watch her chase something that would break her heart." "Everything you did?" I asked. She stopped. "At the November 2nd dinner, you told me privately to accept my limits and asked whether I truly thought I would leap over Grant. Then you told the room you wanted what was best for me." I took out the dated note I had made that night. That sentence does not prove who clicked the link. It does explain why my success looked dangerous to you. For months, whenever I let you see an opportunity, you treated my future as something you were entitled to manage. Grant stood so quickly that his chair scraped the floor. I had not prepared him, shown him the folder, or told him that Anchor Line had been a test. "Is this true?" he asked. His voice shook as he looked from the documents to our parents. "While she was struggling, you kept calling me and saying she was not trying hard enough, that she needed to be more like me. Were you interfering with her jobs while using me as the example?" "Grant, sit down," my mother said. "This is between us and your sister." "No, you made me part of it every time you compared us." He looked directly at her. "Did you do it to keep her below me? Because I never asked for that. I never asked you to hold her down so I would look better." Then he turned to me, his face pale. "Monique, I did not know. I would never have agreed to this." "I know," I said. "You were not told about the Anchor Line test, and I have never believed you were part of it." His reaction did not prove which parent had clicked the link. It did remove the excuse that their favored son had wanted, requested, or knowingly benefited from what they had done. That was the moment their family story began to collapse. The evidence had exposed the interference. Grant's refusal exposed what favoritism had cost both of us. The son they had used as the standard was now rejecting the comparison itself. It did not prove that elevating him was their only motive, but it stripped away the claim that they had acted for his sake. My mother stared at Grant. My father covered his face with both hands. I stood and picked up my phone. The last thing I had planned to say was simple. For most of this year, I believed I was useless. The people telling me to watch and learn from my brother were also treating my opportunities as theirs to cancel. You did not teach me that I could not stand on my own 2 feet. You kept kicking them out from under me and calling it gravity. No one answered immediately. Some relatives looked at the documents. Others looked at my parents. The room had not become one unanimous jury, but the version of me my parents had presented could no longer stand unchallenged. I picked up my bag and deliberately took out the cracked book before closing it again. I opened the cover long enough for the table to see my name, written incorrectly inside. "This is what I received when Grant received a college fund and a car," I said. "You called neglect independence, then used my independence as something to punish." Aunt Meredith looked from the book to my mother. "I remember that dinner," she said. I saw the difference, and I said nothing. That was wrong. Her statement was brief, public, and limited to what she had actually witnessed. My mother stood quickly. "I'll walk you out." I let her. The public record was complete. The private confrontation had not begun. We stepped onto the back porch. The air was cold enough to show our breath. Through the window, I could see relatives still seated around the unfinished meal. Grant stood apart from them, pale and shaken, while Aunt Meredith remained near the table after saying what she had witnessed. My mother pulled her cardigan closed. "You've humiliated us in front of everyone. Was that worth it?" "You did that yourselves," I said. "I stopped protecting the version of events you used against me." "We were protecting you," she answered before I had finished. "You don't have children, so you don't understand. You kept reaching for jobs that were too big, and I could see how badly one enormous failure would hurt you. Better some disappointment now than watching you break later. We were trying to keep you safe." "Stop," I said. "Protection does not require impersonating me or canceling opportunities without my consent. I cannot prove that you interfered with every hiring process, and I am not claiming that. I can prove Vareo received a withdrawal I never sent, and that someone in your household used the Anchor Line test link after only you and Dad were given the details. That was not one frightened mistake. It required information, preparation, access, and a choice to act. You had more than one chance to stop treating my future as something you were entitled to control, and you chose not to. And while I was cutting rent, counting groceries, and wondering whether I had ever been as capable as I thought, you kept offering the smaller life you had selected as if it were rescue. That is not protection. It is control disguised as concern." She had no answer that did not repeat the same excuse. The porch door opened behind us, but it was my father, not another relative. Aunt Meredith had already said what she needed to say at the table. He stepped outside, closed the door, and looked first at my mother, then at me. "We made decisions because the situation was getting out of control," he said. "You kept rejecting the practical option. Roy could have given you steady work, and instead you kept chasing companies that did not know you." "You do not get to call my independence a situation," I said. "And you do not get to turn Roy's office into proof that sabotaging me was reasonable." He looked toward the yard. "We thought once you settled down you would understand." "Oh no, you thought that if enough opportunities disappeared, I would return to the role you had chosen for me." Neither of them corrected that. My mother's expression changed as she realized the private conversation was not restoring her authority. My father had joined her, but he had not given her a better defense. He had only confirmed that bringing me home had mattered more to them than allowing me to decide where my life went. My mother glanced at him as if she expected him to repair the conversation. Instead, he said, "We knew you would be angry if you understood what we were doing." "That is why you hid it," I replied. "Not because you were uncertain, because you knew I had not consented." He tried to turn the issue back toward results. "You have a good job now. Maybe everything worked out." "Everything worked out after I removed you from the process. That does not erase the months I spent blaming myself for decisions you made in secret." For a moment, Neither of them spoke. The cold had stripped the family performance away, but desperation was not the same as accountability. They were finally saying more of the truth, yet neither had named the harm without wrapping it in necessity. "So what happens now?" my mother asked. "You cut us off and punish us forever?" "No, I am not going to organize my life around punishing you. That would still let you run it." I closed my bag. I accepted a senior position at Brightwater, obtained through channels you never knew. I start in January, and I will complete the remaining pre-employment steps without your involvement. You will not be involved in my career, finances, accounts, applications, references, or professional contacts again. You have lost access to those parts of my life. Any relationship we have will be limited, on terms I choose, at a distance I decide, and it begins with you never telling me who I am allowed to become. I held her gaze. I am not slamming the door. I am the one holding it now, not you. Access will depend on whether your behavior changes, not on how urgently you demand forgiveness. I did not wait for another explanation. I had learned that staying for the last word only mattered when I still needed the speaker's permission. When I crossed back through the house, Grant met me near the door and hugged me. "I'm sorry," he said. "I want to learn how to be your brother without all of this, if you'll let me." "I'd like that," I said. "On our own terms, just us." Then I stepped into the cold and drove back to my studio. For the first time that year, the quiet in my car did not feel like evidence that I had failed. It was simply quiet, with no one else's judgment waiting inside it. The weeks after were strange in their gentleness. I kept waiting for the crash, the guilt, the second-guessing, and it didn't come. What came instead was space. December was small and good. I completed Brightwater's pre-employment paperwork and met the team informally over coffee. My actual start date remained in January. In the middle of the month, I moved from the studio into a one-bedroom apartment with 2 real windows facing open sky instead of a brick wall. Claire helped me carry boxes upstairs. When we finished, she stood in the empty living room with light coming through both windows and said, "The market was difficult, but you were never the problem." This time, I did not cling to the sentence as borrowed reassurance. I believed it because my work, the clean hiring process, and the signed offer had already given me evidence of my own. Before the month ended, I began therapy with a calm woman who let me say the uncomfortable truth aloud. Part of me still wanted my mother to call and say she was proud of me. I might never stop wanting that completely. But wanting recognition from her did not require me to return the keys to my career, accounts, or private life. I was only beginning to learn the difference between a wound and a leash, and I did not pretend that a few December sessions had already healed it. Grant came over for dinner near the end of the month. He brought a cheap bottle of wine, and we sat at my small table talking first about ordinary things, then carefully about our parents. He told me he had stopped taking calls in which they wanted to discuss me or use him as the example I should follow. "I kept thinking I was the lucky one," he said. "It turns out being the favorite in a family like that is another kind of trap." He was right, but I did not make his discomfort equal to what they had done to me. They had used him as a standard, and me as the child who was supposed to fall short. Rebuilding our relationship meant refusing both roles rather than pretending the damage had been identical. My parents sent a letter instead of calling. It was 2 pages long, full of explanations written as "we," and it reached near the end for an apology phrased as regret for how I had felt. It did not identify the Vireo message, the anchor line withdrawal, or the choices they had made. I read it once and placed it in a drawer. I did not tear it up, answer it, or treat its arrival as reconciliation. Maybe someday I will respond. Maybe I will not. An apology does not regain access simply because it arrives in writing. The choice belongs to me now, and that ownership matters more than producing an immediate final answer for them. On the last night of the year, I unpacked the last box in my new apartment, and at the bottom of it was the book. Standing on Your Own 2 Feet, cracked spine, my name misspelled in blue pen, the thing they'd handed me at 18 to tell me I was alone. I stood there holding it for a while, and then I did something I hadn't planned. I found a pen, and under the wrong spelling of my name, I wrote the right one. Monique, 1 N, the way it's actually spelled, the way I actually am. And then I put the book on the shelf, face out, at eye level, where I'd see it every day. Not because they were right that I'd have to stand on my own, but because I had, and I did, and it turned out I'd always been able to. The book had never been a prophecy about my weakness. It had been all along, without them ever meaning it to be, the truest thing they ever gave me. I just had to survive their version of it to write my own name on the cover. My new job begins in a few days after the year itself has ended. I have windows now, a brother learning to know me without comparison, and a life whose private doors belong to me. My parents remain 40 minutes away at the same dinner table, but my former seat is no longer available for the role they assigned me. I survived the year they tried to reduce me. I rebuilt from a bottom they helped create, and I no longer need them to calculate my worth. I know what I can do. This time, the proof belongs to me. If you've ever been the one they called strong so they wouldn't have to help you, the one told to shrink so someone else could shine, the one who started to believe the smallest version of yourself because the people who were supposed to love you kept insisting on it, I want you to hear this. Sometimes the failure was never yours. Sometimes you were good enough the whole time, and someone just kept moving the finish line in the dark. If any of this found something true in you, I'd like to know your story. What did they tell you that you were, and who did you turn out to be instead? I'll be reading.